Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us to discuss this really important topic. I am Nechama Price. I am the director of GPATS. I am a senior lecturer at Stern College, where I teach courses in the rules of Nida and marriage and intimacy. And I'm the very proud Yoetzet Halacha of Englewood, Tenafly, West Orange, Livingston, Long Branch, New Jersey. I'm here tonight with Eli Chavalis, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist with a specialty treating sexual issues, an author, lecturer, and creator of an online course titled Sacred Not Secret, a religious parent's guide to a healthy, holy sex education. And we're also here tonight with Bracha Bardwichter, a certified Kala teacher, birth doula, and sex and intimacy coach. Thank you, ladies, for joining me this evening. I wanted to start with a very short overview of the halachic background to what we're going to be discussing tonight, which hopefully now you all see the source sheet in front of you. We are going to be discussing tonight consent, but in order to understand consent when it comes to the bedroom, we have to understand the basic mitzvah of Ona. There is a biblical obligation, come from source number 1 in Shmo Parachaf Aleph, that a husband is required, se'ara ksuta va'onata. A husband is required to give his wife, as Rashi translates, food, but also covering, meaning clothing, a home, and onata tashmish. He has to devote to his wife time. He has to devote to his wife intimacy. He has to devote to his wife pleasure within the bedroom. If you look at source number 2, there has to always be a definition in terms of what is the biblical obligation. Every rule that is d'oraita or d'Rabbanan has rules that you need to follow. And what's fascinating about this rule is because everybody would agree the rules of Ona can't be the same for every single person. We all have different desires, different lifestyles. It'll be very hard to place the same rules on every couple. And that is why, as the Rambam writes and the Shulchan Aruch Paskins in source number 2, this is a subjective, to some extent, halacha. L'kol ish ve'ish kefi kocho, every person based on their own strength, kefi melachto, based on their job, based on their energy. And as we see very clearly, I gave you a source here, the Shari Orah of Shlomo Levi, a modern source. There are so many factors. Gil, age, matzav nafshi, different emotional factors that are going on. And of course, if you go on to the line I underlined, lirtzonam shel b'nei hazog, it's about desire of the couple. And he says the following rule: b'derech klal tadirut ha'ona tzricha likaveh paskama ben b'nei hazog. How often a couple is together, what they're like when they're together, this is all based on their agreement, their consent with each other, and what they would like to be able to do in the bedroom. But there are certainly focus in the mitzvah of what the mitzvah really is about. And if you look at source number 3, the Gemara in Pesachim tells us this mitzvah is about V'ha'amar Rava chayav adam l'sameach ishto b'dvar mitzvah. A man is required to make his wife happy when it comes to this mitzvah. And if you look at Rashi, imroesha mitavit lo. Anytime a husband realizes that his wife would like to have intimacy with him, would like to have a intimate moment, physical intimacy with him, he is required to try to act upon that to give in to her desire. And that really is what the mitzvah of Ona is about. If you look at Rav Moshe Feinstein in source number 4, everything where I bolded, this mitzvah d'oraita, this biblical obligation, is for a husband to realize when his wife is desiring, when his wife is in the mood, that is when he has this obligation, of course, when he is also in the mood and desiring, to act upon it. But it really is a biblical obligation on the husband towards the wife. I gave you a second tshuva here of Moshe Feinstein just to clarify. Sometimes people misunderstand and think that this mitzvah is really just about having children. And because we have an obligation to have children, therefore we must have an obligation to be together sexually in the bedroom. And says Rav Moshe, Eino tluya be'efshariot ha'ibor. It has nothing to do with the ability to get pregnant or not. It doesn't matter if she's pregnant. It doesn't matter if she's nursing. It doesn't matter if she's past menopause. There is a biblical obligation that she should get pleasure, and of course there shouldn't be pain. And therefore I just gave you 2 incredible sources in source number 5, 2 modern poskim who basically explain to us 2 sources or 2 really great svarim that tell us what the mitzvah of Ona is about. Rabbi David Feldman, who happens to be the father of the Rosh Yeshiva, Rabbi Daniel Feldman, just so beautifully captures what it all adds up to is the concept of marital relations as the duty of the husband and the privilege of the wife. Or if I look at Rav Avram Peretz Friedman from this incredible book, Marital Intimacy, the mitzvah of Ona ensures that a husband will create the atmosphere that will satisfy his wife's emotional as well as her physical needs. And therefore, if we see factor number one of the mitzvah of Ona, is that this really is about the woman. This really is about her needs, her desires, and a woman needs to make known her desires. She needs to state when she is in the mood and when this is something that she wants. But there's two other factors before we open the floor to our first discussion, which is source number 6, which discusses, if we can move to the next page, source number 6, Kedoshim Tihiyu. We have a requirement to be kadosh. And whenever we do a mitzvah, the reason or the way that one can be kadosh within a mitzvah is if somebody, sometimes when we want to do something, there's restrictions. And by keeping those restrictions, we make the action kadosh. If we want to eat something, it's a delicious food. In order to make it kadosh, we have the fact that you have to eat kosher. We have the fact that you don't have milk and meat together. We have the fact that you make a bracha before you eat something. We do something that we want, but because we follow these restrictions, we follow the rules, it becomes kadosh. And that's the same thing about the mitzvah of Ona. To make the intimate life between husband and wife kadosh, we have rules. We have, of course, that one is not allowed to have sex with anybody else. We have the fact that intimacy of this form is forbidden when one is in nida. And we have the general rules of the bedroom in terms of a lot of the different mitzvos that we have here of Ona and the rules of consent and some of the things we're going to discuss tonight. So we certainly have the fact that there's a priority of the woman's pleasure and the woman's desire. We have Kedoshim Tiyu acting in a holy way, but we also have the fact that sex is supposed to be about love. Sex is supposed to be about love between a husband and a wife. And if you look at source number 7, I don't know why this source sheet isn't moving. I apologize, but I will move it. Source number 7, we see the famous pasuk in Breshit, where in Breshit it says, "V'davak b'ishto v'ayu lebasar echad," right? That one is supposed to, Naomi, I'm going to move it, okay? That one is supposed to stick to their wife. And when we have the beautiful psukim about Adam Harishon in source number 7, Adam Harishon, where he leaves his parents and he sticks with his wife, right? We have the imagery of a husband and wife coming together in an intimate way to show their love one to the other. And therefore, we really understand that sex is not just about intimacy, but sex is about a way of showing your spouse how much that you love them. And based on that, we have the following rules that I show you here in source number 8, which are the rules we call the Tesha Midot. There are certain things that are just inappropriate within the bedroom, or where intimacy between husband and wife is really not about the right things, or the act of sex is about the wrong things, and therefore becomes inappropriate in the bedroom. We are going to take some time to talk about the first two, Ema and Anusa, which is a lack of consent for between the husband and wife. But I want to focus now on love, and where we see these other rules, b'nei tsnu'ah, a husband and wife, the Shulchan Aruch says, is not allowed to have sex if they hate each other in that moment, because then that act is only about the physical and it's not about love. B'nei tmura, where the Shulchan Aruch says, litein dato al dat acheret, a man or a woman can't be having sex with their spouse and thinking about somebody else. B'nei meriva, a man and woman are not allowed to have sex when they're in a big fight, because it's not about love at all. B'nei shichrut, when one of them or both of them are drunk, you're not thinking about the other person. Or b'nei grushat halev, when you've decided to get divorced. To sum it up nicely, in source number 9, the Ravid very clearly says, "Bi'ilat isha," the physical act of intimacy between a husband and a wife, is something that is supposed to be precious. It's something that's supposed to be wonderful. It's supposed to be mitoch ava. It's supposed to be from love. And therefore, when it's about hatred, and when it's about fighting, and when it's about being drunk, it's not about love. And that is something that would be inappropriate in terms of the mitzvah d'oraita, the biblical obligation of Ona. And therefore, I'd like to open this discussion now to Elisheva and Bracha, where I feel, and I'm sure that you both feel in your roles, that people misunderstand this biblical obligation. People think in an imbalanced way that there's a requirement outside of the priorities of what the woman wants, outside of the priority of love. And I'd love to hear from you in terms of your thoughts on this discussion, if one of you would like to begin.
I'm happy to start. First of all, thank you so much, Nechama, for that wonderful introduction and all those beautiful sources. Something that really struck me is the fact that the Torah uses the 3 words for what a husband is obligated to give his wife. None of them is the usual word. They each are sort of a different kind of word than the typical. And because we're focusing on the mitzvah of ona, and we talked about this a little bit amongst ourselves, like it's a very specific word, and it means to respond. You know, it's a responsive responsibility sort of relationship. And you know, I like the idea of words, because I feel like, especially in Torah and in the relationship that we have to Torah and interpreting it into our lives, I think that like language is so powerful. And the word to touch in Hebrew, and even in biblical Hebrew, is nogea, right? And nogea can be a nega, which is something that is an affliction, or it can be oneg, right? The same words, different context, right? Different order, which can mean pleasure. And the topic of desire and consent and pleasure make all the difference in how a person experiences touch, right? In the meaning that we attribute to it. And something that I've always been struck by about the Tesha Mido, like the 9 restrictions that Halacha puts upon us with regard to really, I mean, I guess really both spouses, but more specifically some of them for the husband, is we often think about consent and the concept of consent as, and especially as applied to things like when drunk, or when, you know, under the influence of intoxication, or when somebody's sleeping, or when there's like thoughts of infidelity, as being more of a like sort of progressive contemporary innovation. But here we have like Chazal preempted all of this, and they've said to us that there is a sanctity, right? That kedoshim to you, that we elevate this. This is not just a physical act. This is something that needs to be holy, and part of the way that we make it holy is by enacting this intentionality, and is by ensuring desire, is by making sure that the relationship, it feels safe to both parties. Somebody had messaged me and said, like, do you really think that consent is enough for sexual activity? Don't you think there needs to be desire? And I thought it was a really, really great question. I think we're going to, as we do like further along in your source sheet, we'll talk about the spectrum, the continuum between, you know, anas, right, actual rape versus pressured versus, you know, like there's gradations of what consent and desire look like. And it's so important to keep in mind. And it's so beautiful to see how the halacha kind of bakes it in to the requirement of what marriage is supposed to be. I could go on and on, but I'm sure Bracha has stuff to say too.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I want to actually echo in terms of the pressure versus the pleasure part. I see this a lot with my clients in my practice, that so many people do struggle with making that discernment. I think this class is so amazing, and Elisheva pointed out so beautifully, like how the wording makes such a difference, you know, in terms of knowing what the difference actually is, so that women and men can communicate with each other more effectively in terms of, what do I want? What do I need? Do I know how to make you happy? Am I curious about that? And I think that's very powerful.
I'm so glad that you brought up that piece about communication, because, you know, when you brought the source about simcha, right, to make sure that a person's emotional needs are met in this context, right, how will we know, right? How do you know if something feels good? A lot of the couples that I work with, a lot comes back to education, which is why I'm so grateful to this organization for putting together this incredible, you know, psychoeducational seminar, all these seminars. But what, you know, one of the things that I think is so critical is, you know, some women get the instructions, which to me, it feels very tragic, of just never say no to your husband. Like whatever, anytime he wants to, you know, to touch or to, you know, have sexual activity or to be together, just never say no to him, because that, you know, that would be corrosive to the marriage. And that's not something that feels very healthy to me. It doesn't feel like it's in line with halacha. It doesn't feel like it's in line with healthy relationships, because if a person doesn't feel that she has the right to say no, then how meaningful is her yes, right? Until I had written an article called "I Used to Rape My Wife," and it was one of the, I think it was the single most shared and read article that I ever wrote, and I didn't anticipate that, but I think it had touched on this topic of marital consent, and then that sort of led, the feedback on that led to Bracha and me doing a video, really kind of educating people, and it was really, there were just so many couples who just had never heard of this idea of communicating about consent after marriage, right? Like just because you're married to each other doesn't mean that one or both people are always going to be in the mood for sexual activity. And the only way to know is through verbal dialogue, because sometimes people will misinterpret body language, and that can lead to, you know, very upsetting and traumatic arguments, whereas like good, honest, open, loving, respectful communication can go such a long way in making sure that this activity that's supposed to be oneg stays in the context of oneg, and not nega, God forbid.
Okay, on that topic, if you don't mind, I just want to present, because we're talking about consent. Let's just discuss some sources on consent. So hopefully the source sheet will pop back up for a moment, and then let's take that idea that Elisheva just said, which is a lot of people just don't realize that there is a concept of rape within a marriage, and that halacha recognized that already at such an early state, already in the time of the Gemara. So I guess I'm going to put the source sheet back up if it'll go. Okay, so hopefully some of you have access to the source sheet, but I'm going to read you some. And Naomi, if you could put up the source sheet. In source number 10, the Gemara in Eruvin actually says straight out, Asur l'adam sheyichof ishto l'dvar mitzvah. A lot of times people don't realize, oh, we're married, so it's not rape if I force my wife. The Gemara said it's asur to rape your wife. Like that was already discussed from the very, very beginning. And this, of course, was based on a pasuk. It's a pasuk in Mishlei that says, Gam b'lo das nefesh lo tov. Without consent, it isn't good. A person is not allowed to have sex with a wife without consent. Not only does the Rambam bring it up in 3 different locations, he also brings it up in source number 11 under the Yisr of Chavala. You're not allowed to hurt another person. And he says, you know what? That also includes raping your wife. And this is brought down in source number 12 as a halachic concept that we bring down the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch. A man is never allowed to rape his wife. But I want to go back to source number 8, because source number 8 was the Teisha Midos. And the Teisha Midos that we mentioned before, the first 2 were B'nai Ema and B'nai Anusa. And the question, of course, is why are there 2? What is the difference between Ema and Anusa that the Gemara decided to give us 2 of these Teisha Midos? And if you look at source 13, the Ran differentiates between Ema and Anusa. Anusa is rape. Anusa is you're saying no and somebody is saying yes, and they are forcing you to do something that you are saying no to. Ema is you are saying yes, but you're saying yes out of fear. You're saying yes because you don't feel that you could say no. So therefore you are saying yes. And that, thank you, is mentioned in our source sheet here in source number 8 as an issue in terms of the Teisha Midos, something that would be considered to be rape. And I brought down as an example here in source number 13 that we are up to, which is the Gemara in Sanhedrin, where the Gemara in Sanhedrin brings down the idea of Esther, who acts karka olam. As we all know, with Achashverosh, she acted completely passively. And therefore the assumption was she was not consenting. She wasn't saying yes, but she clearly was not consenting to Achashverosh. And therefore we have this idea of sometimes you don't say no, but you don't want it. And that is something that is completely inappropriate. If you just look quickly with me at source 14, which is the Igeres HaKodesh written by or found in the Kitvei HaRamban, we see very clearly he writes a letter telling men, what do you do when you're in the bedroom? And he says to them, Lo yablanu bal kocha, never have sex with her against her will. Lo yanosata, never rape her. And therefore, it's not just that. Look where I underline. Tir shatarui l'shamesh. Before you have sex with your wife, make sure you're ready. Asay shetei das ishtecha muskemet ledatcha. Make sure she's in agreement. Make sure she wants to be doing what you're about to be doing with her. Make sure that you're both on the same page. But just being on the same page is not enough. And I think Elisheva referenced this earlier in source number 15. It has to be, says the Rambam, biratzon, but also b'simchatam. It has to be done with happiness. It has to be that you're both wanting to be there, that you both want this. So the idea that we want to discuss next is the idea of, well, what happens when it's not mutual, right? It's not that one really doesn't want it and one does, and therefore it would be considered rape. But one's like not really in the mood. It's not like really on the same page, and the other one really, really does. And you want to be able to be with your spouse because you want to fulfill the needs that they have. If you look at the Shulchan Aruch in source 15, well, you know what happens in that situation in a halachic way, which is it's not that now that's considered rape and therefore that's a problem, but rather if you have spouses that are on different pages, so what does the Shulchan Aruch say? Im eino meratzeh, yifasenu ad shetitratzeh. You have one spouse that doesn't really not in the mood. The other spouse really wants to have relations. So what should they do? They should try to get their spouse in the mood. Snuggle with them, touch them, say loving things to them, hug, kiss, put your spouse in the mood. And then of course, that would be something that would be very ideal. So I wanted to talk to Elisheva and Bracha for a moment about these different scenarios, the scenarios of obviously a wife learning that she has a right to say no, or a husband has a right to say no. Certainly no one ever has to be forced within a relationship. And the idea that obviously not always a couple will always be on the exact same page, and therefore the effort that has to be put in to make sure that the relationship is always going to be one that is mutual and consensual and besimcha, as the Rambam says. So I'd like to ask Elisheva and Bracha if they'd like to comment.
So I also just admire so much the nuance that's also built into this halacha. The difference between ema and anas is very often in sessions we'll have a couple for whom the sexual activity has become not as enjoyable, and I'll start to kind of scope out and diagnose like when this started and what happened and what's going on with them. And often what will come out, not always because every couple has a different story, but it's not unusual to find that a woman will say, sex used to be more fun, but now I don't know, it's become more of a chore. And what'll happen is that he's not forcing, he's not demanding, but he might not even be aware of this, but he gets really grumpy and sometimes even passive aggressive, or withdrawn when he has been rejected, or when she's not available for sex as often as she wants him to be. And so there's this like nonverbal communication cycle where she sort of knows, like, if I have sex with my husband, he'll be happier. And if I don't, then there'll be like sort of a subtle emotional price to pay, or not so subtle emotional price to pay. And to me, that feels like a really good example of ema. There's like, sometimes a couple will say like, I say, when did the problem start? And she'll realize, oh, when I realized that he could, have a temper. And right. So anger is like very toxic and not that people aren't allowed to get angry. Everybody can get angry sometimes, but certain kinds of angry behavior are something that can really stamp out the pleasure and the desire, because if a person is having sex from a place of fear rather than a place of love or desire, that would totally fall under probably halachic category of ema, even if it's implied, like even if he didn't have to actually come out and say, well, if you say no, I'm going to be angry. But if she knows that that's been the routine, that can very easily take the pleasure out of the experience for both of them, actually. And there's a moment that I love in a lot of the sessions that I have with couples, which is where, and I want to just acknowledge something. We're talking right now in this context about a certain gender stereotype, which I believe that some gender stereotypes, I know some people don't like them, but some of them are stereotypes because they're often true, not always true. And in these particular cases, we're talking about where the husband has the stronger libido, he has the stronger sex drive, and the wife is sort of like struggling to keep up with it. There are many couples, and I get called out on this all the time because a lot of my writing talks about that stereotype. There are definitely couples where the wife has the stronger desire and the husband is struggling to keep up, and she's dealing with the rejection feelings, and that's very, very valid. But we are talking about, what is more common in this particular context. So there's a moment that I have with a lot of couples where a wife is sort of like making herself available to her husband as a form of like damage control, right? I'll say to the husband, let me ask you a question. I'll say, if your wife said to you, we can have any kind of sexual activity anytime you want. I'm available for you 24/7. I don't especially enjoy it, but I don't hate it. Like, just kind of like do what you need to do and like move on, right? Like that will be, you're never going to get a no from me. That's option number one. Or option number two, we're only going to be physically intimate once a week, but that once a week is going to be like mind-blowingly mutually pleasurable. You're going to feel in her body like the desire, the excitement, the passion, the love that's underlying. It's going to be fantastic, right? I have yet to have a husband who picks the first option. And very often the wives are looking at them like, wait, what? They're like shocked by this because they don't realize that like libabai, they really want, and of course, sometimes they're like, well, does it only have to be once a week? I know. And again, like part of the beauty of the halacha is that everybody's different and we have to like kind of acknowledge both spouses' needs and limitations. But I think that ema piece, like there are certain relationships in which ahava and yira can coexist. In our relationship with Hashem, that has to be there. But in relationship to a spouse, having sexual activity from a place of fear of emotional retribution afterwards is such a passion killer, as opposed to, when you're coming from a place of, mutual love and desire. Even if the quantity is going to be reduced, the quality goes up. And when the quality goes up, eventually the quantity goes up too, because when something feels good, you end up wanting to do it more often. When something doesn't feel good, you end up wanting to do it less frequently. I'm talking a lot again. Bracha, you want to chime in?
Well, I was going to bring up the male versus female thing, and then you did.
I'm sorry.
Hey, it's true. I'm glad that you did bring it up because I would say it's pretty common, especially now with men who are on antidepressants or anxiety medications. A lot of times their libido does go down, their sex drive, and the women are left wondering, like, why isn't he pursuing me? And she's the one in the position where she's trying to get him to be, interested in her, and he's not. So I definitely think it's important to bring up both genders in that context. I actually wanted to mention something from the 9 midos from before, that one place in terms of the communication and the consent aspect that I see it tied in a lot with clients is when a woman's not supposed to directly request for relations, to directly ask for sex. And that puts a lot of women in this position where it's like, well, I'm trying to turn him on, let's say in the context of the man being less interested than the woman, the husband than the wife. And she's like, I'm trying to turn him on and I want to get him in the mood. And I am that person who is more interested than he is, but I can't ask him and I can't be as forthcoming. So I just think it's important to, share with women that there is a way to arouse your husband and seduce him and get him interested that is not done in that direct manner that the Gemara is talking about.
I'm so happy that you mentioned that, Bracha, and I want to add something to your list besides the, the antidepressants and the other stressors that will sometimes reduce a male sex drive. There's something that actually took me a couple of years to figure out, but it's a really important variable. Very often when a marriage starts out with difficulty with consummation, with difficulty specifically with penetrative intercourse, vaginismus, dyspareunia, pain, different kinds of physiological problems in terms of sex, that will unconsciously influence the husband's sex drive. So if you have a good man, right? And most men I think are good men, so we're talking about the example I gave before. Good men will always say, I would rather have sexual activity that my wife is enjoying than her just being available to me without, emotional involvement, because that's not fun for anybody, right? And they're good people, right? So, when you have a good man who's having sex with his wife 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 months, 5 months, and every time he hears her wince and she's clenching her fists or the sheets, or it's not comfortable for her, even if the foreplay and outer course are pleasurable, he starts to sort of habituate to this stimulus of hold on a second, I love this person, I don't want to be hurting her. And so there's a part of him that kind of shuts down. And so there's a very sort of behavioral and psychological mechanism there. And sometimes I've seen even years later where it will be there's nothing wrong essentially with this guy's sex drive, but because of this process, and even if she's not having, sexual problems or intercourse problems anymore, he's a little bit traumatized. He's just I'm scared. I don't want to hurt you. That's not worth it to me. It's not, and so, that's one piece. Or, sometimes when, if a woman is taking a longer time to develop her libido at the beginning of the relationship, and there has been a lot of rejection, again, very often he'll shut himself down, because how many times do you want to get rejected, or how many times do you want to put your wife on the spot? And so the history of the relationship is so critical when you're analyzing where a couple is at, in their relationship today, and sort of saying, being able to, and again, the beauty of the halacha is that it's all built in here, is that very often, and again, we're working with these gender stereotypes, but one spouse might say, I need to feel emotionally intimate and physically very safe and calm in order to desire physical intimacy. And sometimes you'll have the other spouse saying, well, I need to have sex in order to feel emotionally intimate. So they're in this cat chasing its tail syndrome of okay, well, if he needs sex to feel close, then she needs to feel close in order to have sex. So whose needs go first? And I think the halacha is telling us very unequivocally, emotional safety comes first, because it's more reasonable to expect someone to put themselves out emotionally and say, hold on, let's bond, let's build simcha, let's build ahava, let's build haskama. All of these are very, very clear words that tell us that, making sure that the psychological framework is safe, so we don't end up in, God forbid, a situation where there's marital sexual trauma.
So let me pick up on what you just said, because I think you said something that is tremendously important to point out about the halacha of the mitzvah of Oda. You see, if you are on the source sheet, I'm going to actually move to source 21. But I think very often what people think when they think about the mitzvah of Oda is that this is really just about sex. How often should a husband and wife have sex, right? Because that's really what the Mishnah tries to define. But that's not really what the mitzvah of Oda is about. The mitzvah of Oda is about how to make sure that your wife is happy, how to sexually satisfy her. And if you look at so many of these sources, part of the mitzvah of Ona is the beginning, is the before the act of sex or afterwards. It's the physical intimacy and the happiness that comes from the big picture. If you just look at this amazing Gemara, source 21, it's one of my favorite Gemaras because it's just so hilarious. But there's a story of Rav Kahana who is hiding under the bed of Rava. This is in source, the bed of Rav in source 21. And what does he hear? He hears Disach v'sachak v'sasarchav. He sees that Rav is like having a good time with his wife, like they're joking around, they're having a good time, and he gets all confused and he calls out from under the bed and he's like, what are you doing? Like, it's as if you've never had sex before. Why are you acting this way? And of course, Rav's reaction is not to explain, but rather to say, get out of my room. Why are you here? But the point of the story is that that's an essential part of the mitzvah of Ona, is to have, conversation before and to make sure that everybody's in the mood and everyone is feeling loved and happy. If you look at source 22, that is what he was doing. She was making sure that she was in the mood by saying really nice things about her. And the Rambam in source 23 adds it as the requirement of the mitzvah of Ona. It's not just about happiness, it's about conversation. He should talk to her. They should have a conversation and they should talk about how much they love each other. Or, everybody should feel good about themselves, how beautiful they feel that the other spouse is. Rav Moshe Feinstein, source 24, even adds that an important part of the biblical obligation of Ona is chibuk v'nishak, right? It's hugging and kissing. It's not just about, the act of intercourse. It is about the whole picture of feeling close to each other, of intimacy, of snuggling, of touching, of hugging and kissing. And the Gemara in source 25 even talks about making sure that not just he gets the physical pleasure of the release, but she also gets strong physical pleasure every single time. And that is something to always very much keep in mind. I gave you source 26, a letter from the Steipler Rebbe, which I think is just so important for us to have this discussion, that sometimes, when you were talking about, different needs of different genders, often after the act of sex, one spouse could just turn over and be done. And says the Steipler Rebbe that not necessarily is good enough for both sides. If you have sex in a way where your wife, or I would even put on your husband, feels that they are just not sexually satisfied, that this wasn't good enough for them, even if the other person feels that was satisfying, that really is not good enough. That is something that would not be qualified as the mitzvah of Ona. And therefore, I think this discussion that we're having, and maybe Bracha, you want to say something about this fact of making sure that because the husband and wife get satisfied in different ways, to always make sure and to understand that part of the obligation of the husband to the wife is to make sure that even if he's feeling the pleasure, that she is as well. And sometimes, as Elisheva brought up in the beginning, that isn't what she's necessarily feeling. And this has to be an ideal. And it can take time in a marriage to figure out the way to make sure that you know how your spouse is feeling pleasure, which is why communication is so important. But it's not, some people I think have this view that sex is about pleasuring my husband and letting him go to sleep, or maybe the other way around. But it really is about making sure that both people are feeling pleasure. I know, Bracha, if you want to add to this conversation.
Absolutely. I think the bottom line is that the Torah actually advocates that the sexual relationship should be a give and take for the most part overall, meaning it's normal, I would say, in certain times in people's lives where your libido is not going to be matched. In fact, probably more often than not. His could be here, hers could be here. It could reverse. Life happens, right? Hormones, pregnancy, postpartum, after a job loss, during a crisis, our libidos shift and change, right? And so it's really important to examine that at any point in the marriage, at any time, you can have these conversations and be open with each other and say, let's say a couple was together and someone does feel like, what, I don't know, last night just didn't feel so amazing. Instead of keeping that to yourself, like, talk about it. Ask your husband, like, was that good for you? Did you notice that afterwards I wasn't so happy, or vice versa? Because the communication is for sure the most important factor here, and not to assume that, oh yeah, since it was good for me, it must have been, great for you.
Yeah, no, that's so important. Thank you, Bracha. As you guys were talking, I was picturing, I don't think you had added this on the source sheet, but on Isha Ki Tazria, right? The Gemara talks a lot about Isha ki tazria, and I remember like in high school, I was thinking that that had to do with ovulation, but I think afterwards I was made to understand that it has to do with female orgasm and pleasure, right? Is that correct, Nechama? Is that how it's often understood?
Isha Tazria, meaning the discussion of her, the pasuk of her having the baby. But in the Gemara that I just wrote, Kadesha Yazriu Nishatem Tchila, that's source 25, that is the explanation that many give, which is to make sure that she also gets an orgasm, which is not something that people necessarily realize is something you have to do extra in order to be able to ensure that within a relationship. So 100%, that language of Yazriu Nishotehem is the language you're referring to 100%. So
yeah, and it's fascinating because in the sexological world, you know, there's like more recent literature talking about female pleasure and female orgasm, and how, you know, that it really hadn't been getting a lot of attention in the general literature on sexology. But again, right there in the Gemara, there's like this, you know, imperative to pay attention to the fact that, you know, most women are not going to orgasm the same way from penetrative intercourse. You know, over 70% of women get their orgasm through external stimulation, mostly clitoral stimulation. You know, and so on the one hand, I think this needs to be part of like the educational process of young men and women, because again, you always only ever lived in your own skin. You don't know what someone else's reality is like, certainly a person of a different gender. So that's why it's so important, A, the education, and B, the communication. But the other piece I want to add is that a lot of women who may not necessarily have had experience with orgasm before they became sexually active in their relationships and marriage, it might take some time to get there. So on the one hand, we want to create the foundation and the framework so that both members of the couple know that the female pleasure is, you know, equally important, or according to a lot of these sources, maybe even more important, you know, but certainly as important. But also to say that, you know, ideally we want to get to a place where she's having like the most pleasure she can, but it might take some time to find her mojo in terms of figuring out what feels good and what's orgasmic. And so it's okay if she sometimes says, you know what, I've had enough pleasure. If we're not getting the orgasm today, you know, we can get it the next time, you know, which is something, because again, like that pressure kills the pleasure. The less we put a pressure on whatever it is, whether it's to perform sexually or to have the pleasure, you know, the more likely it is to come, you know, in a more natural, organic sort of way.
Right. I think another beautiful thing to add to that is that there actually also are sources that talk about how important it is for a husband not only to satisfy his wife, but then that means you need to learn what that even is, right? So it's not good enough for you to like, oh, I think I satisfied her. It's like you're supposed to satisfy her, because that's mitzvah of ona. Then that means you need to learn what does satisfy her, what turns her on, what is her desires, what are her fantasies, what are her interests, right? And again, that's only done through this exploration. I just want to also say that as a college teacher, I totally agree with you, Elisheva, that if college or, you know, young newly married people get married and think like, oh, but I'm supposed to have this like orgasmic experience, then they don't think like, what's wrong with me? Why isn't it working? Am I broken? How do I fix it? That is a lot of pressure automatically from the get-go. You're basically then setting up the couple almost for failure, because from the beginning they have so many expectations and they're failing, right? So I always teach my colleagues like 6 months to a year, like to just learn your body, even enjoy, like stay in the moment, touch each other in different places, take it soft, do it faster, right? Explore more about your body to learn about yourself, what does feel good for you, and then you could relay that to your spouse.
Okay, so Elisheva brought up the line that I happen to think is an amazing line, that pressure kills pleasure. I think that's such an incredible line that I've now heard her say a few times. And I want to just discuss the pressure that can sometimes kill the pleasure. And if we could just put my source up for a second, and then we're going to have quite a bit discussion on these sources. But starting from source 27, I think very often women are confused, or even I would say men sometimes are confused about, again, this mitzvah of ona, what's required of the man, what's required of a woman. And I think what hopefully I was trying to clarify is that the biblical obligation is on the man to help sexually satisfy his wife. It really is one-sided. It's an obligation on the husband. That doesn't mean there's nothing on the wife, but I think that we have to be very clear what is on the wife. If you look at source 27, there is a concept of being a moredet, okay? And that is what we would call in some sense a rebellious wife, whatever that means. And we look at the Gemara, it translates it as mitasha shamita. Now, the way that it is described in the Mishnah is a wife who is on purpose to hurt her husband, not having sex with him for long periods of time. That is the discussion of moredet. Again, it has nothing to do with ona, but it has to do with the fact that when a husband and wife get married to each other, there is, to the extent, an obligation that they're giving to each each other, which is we're going to be exclusive to each other. And therefore, since we are promising that we are only going to be with you, there is also this added idea, which makes sense. Therefore, we will be with each other, right? And therefore, that is why we can promise we'll only be together, because we will be together. And that is why there is this slight obligation, certainly, that's on the female to have sex with her husband, but it's not part of the obligation of Ona. This is not something that, therefore, anyone could point at a specific night and say, you're obligated tonight because of the mitzvah of Ona. That's absolutely not true. But it's about her in general allowing herself to, when she wants, when she is consenting, when she is in the mood, right, to be with her husband on a regular basis. And the only discussion of this being an issue is if we're talking about long periods of time, like really long periods of time, and not because of real issues, but because she just doesn't want to be with her husband and she wants to hurt her husband, that would fall into the category of moredet. And that is a very different discussion than the mitzvah of Ona. So that is one of the reasons, or I would say misconceptions sometimes, where people feel forced, is because they think that they have to. The mitzvah of Ona is telling them that they have to, and that is entirely not true. I want to allow Elishava and Bracha to comment on that before we go into the discussion, which we're going to come back to in a minute, of specific days where people have this assumption that they're supposed to have sex with their spouse. But before we do that, let's let Elishava and Bracha discuss this concept in general.
So I'm so happy that you brought up the issue of moredet, because there are certain sources that will sometimes come up when we're working with Orthodox couples, especially, you know, we live in times where it's, you know, there's no polygamy, right? Everybody's got just one spouse. So, so sometimes, you know, a wife will say, you know, I'm just right now in this season of my life, whether it's because of pregnancy or having a newborn or just different life stressors, something endocrinological going on, different reasons, like just not ever really feeling in the mood. And then you have this husband who's like in this bind of like, well, I only have one sexual partner. Like, what am I supposed to do? Right. And so sometimes, not always, but sometimes men will invoke this idea of moredet, and they'll say like, okay, but you're not being a wife to me. Like what, you know? And so I think if I'm understanding correctly, Nechama, number one, in order to qualify as a halachic moredet, it really has to be lahachis, right? It has to be like a vindictive, angry, kind of like punitive,
yeah.
Right? But another piece that I sometimes like to, you know, mention to couples is that, you know, it's, if a person is suffering, let's say from PTSD, right? Like, let's say there was a sexual trauma that got activated, right? And she's become highly dysregulated and gets off, you know, triggered terribly from certain kinds of sexual touch, right? It's not her obligation to then push herself to re-traumatize herself, you know, because, you know, her husband needs pas in his sal, right? Or, you know, to save him from, you know, his own temptations to do other things. What is, I think, her obligation at that point is to say, I have a problem here and I need to address it. And so to be willing to go and say, let's speak to a therapist. Let me do the work. Let me figure out what's going on with me, because if I love my husband and he loves me, I don't want to be in this state where I get, you know, trauma triggered from my husband. And that's true also when there's physical pain, right? And so there's this balancing on the one hand of the empathy for the person. And again, it could be the husband or the wife. I'm talking about what's, you know, tadir in, you know, my practice at least, you know, where you have a woman who like really does love her husband, wants to be there for him emotionally, personally, sexually, in every way. There's some sort of obstacle. And so then what we want to do is we want to say, okay, what can we do here, right? So, you know, a husband can't pressure or force his wife to have sex, but what he can say is, look, in order for this marriage to be, you know, to have endurance, we need to address the issue that's arisen here. Am I understanding and applying the concept of moredet correctly here? Yeah. Rachel, did you want to say more?
Sure. I'll add an idea of what I sometimes recommend to clients that are in that situation about like scheduling sex. Like for some couples, while they're working out how to add it back into their life in a positive way, the frequency, not talking about during a traumatic event, obviously, or during triggers, like that needs to be addressed in therapy. It should always be safe. That's number one, right? But if it is safe and it's just your libido is low, or you're not so interested, or you're trying to rewrite the way that you guys have sex, because in the past it was very much like, but you owe it to me, but I'm not interested, but you're supposed to, but I don't want to. And this like kind of tug of war that the couple sometimes have, then a good medium while they are in therapy, or while they're in coaching, while they're actually addressing it in a healthy way with a professional, they can talk to the professional about that and say, like, what about this option? So it satisfies both partners as far as her not being surprised. She knows when to expect it. He feels like, okay, it's not like, oh, you know, months and months are going to go by where it's never going to happen. And that's usually a safe way to reintroduce it after, a traumatic type of, sexual relationship, or where it's been feeling forced or extremely pressured and you're trying to change that dynamic.
Excellent. Yeah. So 100%, the picture that we're trying to describe here is it's not that she's off the hook. Let's say if, she's somebody who just has no libido and doesn't want to ever be with her husband, then she needs to go for help and she needs to figure out what's wrong and what's going on and go for therapy. But if there is good reason that she's going through an illness or something's going on in her life, nobody can throw moredet at her. This is something that a trauma or something that she's going through, that she certainly has the right to say no for a period of time if that's what she really needs to do. Or for sure, there's no question that night by night, that is something that either side certainly has a right to decline. So that, I think, leads us to the discussion of the days that we seem to have a special mitzvah to have sex at a certain time, where I think often, I who teach, women can hear from a lot of them, or my students, there's kind of this pressure. And very often in these types of cases where women will say, but I don't want to, so because do I have to? And let's go through some of those cases together and then discuss all of them. And I think the wedding night is obviously, the biggest one to discuss. But if we could put the source sheet back up just for a moment. In terms of all of these cases, if I'm on source 29 right now, Rav Moshe Feinstein, when discussing all these cases, and we're talking about cases of Friday night, which is a case of Oneg Shabbos, as we're about to hear, a man going on a trip before he goes on a trip, but when he comes home, mikvah night, which is a big one, and of course the wedding night. And Rav Moshe in source 29, when discussing all these types of cases, tries to explain why Chazal pick different nights to kind of add this extra mitzvah to. And his answer is as follows. The real goal of the mitzvah of Ona is so that a woman is happy sexually. And therefore Chazal was trying to figure out what are the types of scenarios where a woman would really want her husband to give her extra time and really want to be intimate in that situation. And therefore Chazal thought, it would make sense that on Shabbos, when her husband's home and when he's going on a trip, and mikvah night and wedding night, like those are the types of scenarios that the wife would be really desiring. And therefore that's why Chazal created this idea, which therefore by definition would mean that if she's not desiring, it's the opposite of what would actually be required. If you look at source 29, the ikar ha'ona, the most fundamental part of this entire biblical mitzvah, is that a husband sees when his wife desires. And therefore, kavu chachamim, these times where he thought that most women would want it, and that's why that's why these types of scenarios were created. If we look at each one separately very quickly, it becomes very clear within the language as well. If you look about Friday night, so the Rambam brings down in source 30, Friday night is Oneg Shabbos, right? You get double mitzvah. That's why some people call it mitzvah night, right? Because it's the mitzvah of Oneg Shabbos and it's the mitzvah of Ona. But if you look, he's saying Oneg Shabbos. Oneg Shabbos means enjoyment. So by definition of that, it has to be enjoyable. If you look at Rav Kanol, which is another really great book to have if someone wants to read more on this topic, his book is called Marital Covenant, but he has a pamphlet attached called Eight Dudim, and I highly recommend it. And he writes, obviously, this applies only when it suits both partners, since the intention is that their union should be enhanced their Oneg Shabbos and their enjoyment of Shabbos. So too, we have the same idea, source 31, about the Yotzei Laderech, the man who's going on a trip. And therefore, we say he should have sex with his wife before he goes. And if you look at the Gemara, it's very clear. Why? She'isha mishtokeket abal b'shas yotzei laderech. She'll miss him. She's sad. He's leaving. So this is something we're doing to help her. This is not about a requirement on her. This is about doing something that will help her to process the experience. If you look at the Shulchan Aruch, also in source 31, brings the two together, mikvah night and yotzei laderech. They have the same idea. After being apart from your husband for such a long period of time, the assumption is that the wife is so wanting to have sex when when she comes back from the mikvah. They've been apart for such a long time, and therefore she's excited. This is what she wants. So the mitzvah is saying, set aside time specifically on mikvah night. This is not the night, if you can, it's not the night to work late. It's not the night to be doing other things. Spend time with your wife because she is wanting this after 12 days of separation. But obviously, without question, if that's what it's about, if a woman, which is a shilas I get all the time, she just had a baby and she wants to be able to go to the mikvah, that she's not even allowed to have sex yet, right? Or she's really not in the mood, or she's not feeling well, and she's not going to want to have sex with her husband that night. Can she go to the mikvah? And the answer is, of course she can. And then she can communicate to her husband that this is just what she's not in the mood to do. I actually think I'm just going to talk about the wedding night quickly and then allow Elishava and Bracha to pipe in, because this is such an important one. When it comes to the wedding night, this is one of the biggest misconceptions, because very often kalas or chasanim are taught they have to have sex on the wedding night. And this all comes really from an idea that we find here in the Shach I gave you here in source 32, where he's trying to balance this halachic discussion. On the one hand, bilat mitzvah, it's a mitzvah to have sex that first time. It's a mitzvah whenever you have sex the first time. It's not about the first night versus the next day. That's not what it's about. However, pushing off sex from the first night, as the Shach calls it, a not such great idea, is because what we're worried about is a number of factors. Either number one, if they don't consummate their marriage, or if they don't consummate it enough, it could be that if she gets her period soon after the wedding, they then have an issur of yichud and they can't be alone together. It becomes a very big factor. Or if they don't consummate the marriage and then she becomes a nida and now they have to separate, and then they come back together and then they have sex for the first time and now they consummate the marriage, now they have to separate again for dam b'sulim. So they end up having to separate for a very long time when they first get married. And therefore, says the Shach, it may not be the best idea to push it off for too long, because we are concerned, because we are worried of all of these other halachic factors. Maybe they won't be able to control themselves and they'll have sex when she's in nida if she gets her period and they don't end up consummating their marriage. So he says there are factors that we have to worry about. On the other hand, he does not say that it is usher to not have sex on the night of the wedding. And if you look at source 33 in modern poskim, I gave you the Shlomo Levi, who says that there's a tremendous significance to the wedding night to be benachat, besimcha, biktusha, ubetahara, to do it in a way to have sex that first time, which is not painful, which is not, uncomfortable. It should be with comfort. It should be with happiness. It should be kedusha and tahara. It should not be done in a way that feels pressured. If you're tired, you can wait till the next day. If you're feeling pressured, if you're feeling uncomfortable, you are allowed to speak and say, this is not something that I want to do. And certainly, everybody should realize that no way is a husband required to hurt his wife and push himself in a forceful way, but rather to move slowly. She has the ability to say, please stop, this is hurting, and for them to try again the next day. And very often, done in the right way, it takes a while. It could take a few nights sometimes. And I always shock my students when I tell them that, to consummate your marriage, because you have an ability to say, that hurts, please can we stop? And certainly there's a halachic discussion of how far in he needs to penetrate, which is pretty far in order for them to have to separate for dam b'sulim. And therefore, there is a period of time of trying to have sex that can often take place when they first get married. So I wanted to open this discussion, Elishava and Bracha, in terms of people feeling sometimes forced to have sex, thinking that they're doing what they're supposed to do, la halacha, but actually learning the halacha inside, you learn that you have an ability to have a voice, to say on Friday night, I'm really tired, or I don't want to have semen on me for Shabbos when I can't shower. And you're allowed to say, I don't want to have sex tonight, or mikvah night, if that's really not what you want, you're not in the mood, to be able to say that's not what's required. And certainly for a kala, to be able to voice her view in terms of saying, this is not something I want to do on the wedding night, or a little try, but this is something that I want to be able to have a voice in terms of when we consummate our marriage. So Elishava and Bracha, if you'd like to pipe in on this discussion, please.
You want to start this time, Bracha? Because I can always go, but I don't want to steal the mic.
Sure. So actually what I was going to say is that, with the consummation, it's so interesting that what a lot of people believe or think is so, first of all, like you just said, Nechama, it's opposite what the Torah says. But the good news about that is not like to take that halakha lens and say, wow, it's actually emotionally healthier and more sound. What you maybe didn't think, or what you had a preconceived notion of what's negative, it's not supposed to be that way. Every single time a husband and wife are together, even in those special mitzvah night circumstances, it's meant to be consensual. It's meant to be mutual. It's meant to be pleasurable. It's meant to be enjoyed. It's supposed to be something that you're okay with and feel safe with and look forward to and want to do. And I cannot tell you how many times I have women reach out to me who are like, really? Like, I don't have to have sex, on the wedding night. And unfortunately, I deal with a lot of women who have some kind of sexual trauma or very negative associations to sex because their first sexual experience did feel forced, like they didn't have a choice, almost like, okay, but I knew that I had to do that, so he didn't rape me, okay, but you also didn't feel like you were able to say no, and that's a very big problem, right? So I just feel really grateful, obviously, to like God and the Torah, that it's actually very much in line with Judaism, that we don't believe in force and saying, well, you have to no matter what. It's a mitzvah if you want to. It's not a mitzvah if you don't.
Yeah, and I think it's also similar to what we discussed before in terms of the dynamic of moredet. You know, it sounds like there is this halachic preference to try and consummate sooner rather than later because of all these complications that arise if not. But, you know, there's another word that kind of popped into my head, another biblical word that's used for being physically intimate, which is, you know, vayeda, right? Lada'at, right? So that being intimate with someone means getting to know them, getting to know emotionally for sure, and spiritually and intellectually, but also getting to know, like, when we touch, what feels good, what tickles, what hurts, what's uncomfortable, right? And so I think the language between the couple, the language of education, and this is where the premarital education piece is critical. We have a link to a script that I give Kala teachers for free. Just go elishalis.com/Kala, and there's like a lot of information there that's, I think, is so important for Kalas to hear, because if they hear like you have to have sex right after your wedding, that's so overwhelming and intimidating for someone who has, like, you know, literally going from like 20 years of tznius education to like overnight being completely, literally and emotionally naked, right? And it's so much. Whereas if you hear, like, you know, this is when you become, you know, holy to one another and permissible to one another, and it's supposed to feel wonderful, and let's give it a try. Let's, you know, see what we can do so that you can get aroused and pleasured and relaxed and open enough to make this happen. But if you can't, if you're in pain, or if you're scared, or if it's not working for you, then that's not what this is supposed to be. And Nechama, you touched on something that I think is really important and applicable to, I mean, everything is important, but something very specific that, you know, things like Friday night and before a trip and after a trip, it's all motivated by the idea of simcha and oneg. It's supposed to be enjoyable. You know, back in the original sources, you talked about how the mitzvah of ona is independent of ibor. It's not about, like, there's baby making is a mitzvah. It's the very first mitzvah, but love making is a separate. They're two different mitzvahs d'oraisa that we have. And you know, one is not the same necessarily as the other. There's always supposed to be pleasure. And so one thing that I think is really, really great for couples to know is that sometimes they may think that something's prohibited because there are sources that say, you know, light in the room and positions and different things that they might think that they're not supposed to have, or supposed to specifically have as part of their sexual repertoire. But really what Hashem and the Torah and Chazal wanted was for it to be like the utmost mutual pleasure between husband and wife. So it's always worth doing a little research, checking in with a posek, with the yoetzet, with someone who can say, oh yeah, there are sources that say not to do A, B, or C, but if actually the wife is requesting it, like the reason that halacha was enacted was a protection, because the assumption was that maybe women don't like that. But if your wife is saying, or your husband is saying, we would love to do that, then maybe there's room to say, oh, let's do it. So I think this is another example where lada, to make oneself knowledgeable, to have conversations, never to be embarrassed to say to your spouse, I feel like this might feel good, even if it's like a fantasy that you've never shared before. Well, that's what marriage is for, to share the kind of things that you wouldn't share with anyone else. And you never know what you might discover about each other and about what could feel really good together in bed.
Sorry, Bracha, go.
I just wanted to address the fact that there are a few comments in the chat room, and someone wrote, it's common that men today are told to just thrust hard in an effort to help consummate. And I just want to share from my perspective how absolutely damaging that advice is. It not only doesn't necessarily work, even if it does physically, it is very, very damaging emotionally. It's not the way it needs to be done. It could be calm and relaxing and slow and guided and communicated. It should not be just push your way through, even if she says no. That's not in line with halacha. We don't believe in that. It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah that a couple should do that. And I could say from experience of so many clients who have wedding night, trauma or very negative memories, that is not the way to go about it.
I actually had, there was a couple I was working with, and I was checking in because this particular couple, we had decided they needed a hiatus from any kind of penetrative intercourse. And I checked in with the husband. I'm like, are you okay? And he told me, I had never seen this before it was around Parshas Kedoshim pretty recently. And he said, on the Pasuk of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, the Bal HaTurim, right, who's the Tur, brings down, what's his parish on V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha? He says, Shalo Yachov Isha, that Gemara in Erev, is it Erev? Yeah, that's right? Shalo Yachov Isha the Tashmish, that you're not supposed to have all the broad explanations of V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. This is the Bal HaTurim. It's not a gematria. He's saying this is what love is. Love means you don't force love, you invite love, and that's in Parshas Kedoshim, that's the holiest form of love when it's very mutual.
100%. I wanted to add in, we don't have to put the source sheet back up, but it's in sources 18 and 19, where there are two other discussions in the Gemara that I want you both to talk about more, which is, where the woman is consenting, but in source 18, it discusses she's consenting, but then he wants to do more. And all of a sudden, she wants to be able to remove that consent, and that being considered something that also she fully has the right to do. And the sources in 19 and 20 about her consenting to being, intimate or to even have sex, but then the way he wants to have sex or the position that he wants her to be in while having sex is something she feels uncomfortable about. And even just forcing a position on a wife or forcing somebody or a spouse to do something in the bedroom that they felt uncomfortable doing, even though they want to be intimate at that moment, they want to be having sex in that moment, that would also be something that would be considered lack of consent within halacha and would be something that would be forbidden. And women have to know that they can voice it. It's not because you said yes, now that's it, right? You are no longer allowed to remove your consent. So I'm sure both of you have experience with those types of cases as well.
Yeah, it's so sad how one act of what feels like aggression, even if it wasn't intended as violence or aggression, can create such a sense of fear and even trauma that it takes a long time to rebuild the trust and undo the damage. I would hope that it would be sort of like self-explanatory and common sense, but I think it does need to be spelled out the same way in contemporary consent culture. Like it's not ongoing. At any point you can say no or stop or that hurts or I've had enough or I don't like that, right? Halacha for sure says that. And that's part of the whole simcha, ahavas, lada'at, to know what's going on. Oh, I thought I was going to enjoy that, but actually I see I don't. And actually it's in the best interest of the higher libido spouse to honor that as well, even selfishly, because if she feels like the minute she gives a green light, her body is totally like, carte blanche, that's a very helpless, scary feeling. And she's going to be much more likely to put up the stop sign much earlier on in the process, much more frequently. But if she says, listen, I'm not sure if I want to have intercourse tonight, but I love you and I want to cuddle, and can we just like play it by ear and see how it goes? Very often what'll happen is they're having leisurely, playful foreplay, lovemaking, affectionate touch. And then he'll sort of like say, can we make this, because there's, sort of, again, a spectrum between affectionate touch and erotic touching and sexual stimulation and genital. Like there's a whole progression that women tend to need a lot more of the earlier phase of than men. Again, stereotypes, but that is what often is the case. And if she feels safe to say, let's just kiss a little bit, let's just make out, let's just rub each other's backs, and then we'll see where it goes. And she knows the minute she says, okay, now I just want to go to sleep, and he'll be like, no problem, kiss on the forehead, let's call it a night, then they're more likely to have more action more of the time. So both from obviously from a halachic point of view, from a humanistic, moral point of view, but also just strategically, it just makes more sense to be checking in with each other all the time. Does this feel good? Oh no, that tickles. Let's try this. Okay, a little harder, a little softer, a little higher, a little lower. How else is anyone supposed to know, right? And it makes such a big difference. And that's really what lovemaking is. Sex isn't always loving. It's not always intimate, but that's what makes it intimate. I want to know what you feel good, what feels good for you. And the more I know about what feels good for you, the more I can do that, and vice versa. And that's that's the highest level there is.
Absolutely. Yeah. I actually had a client this week who, was trying to repair some damage in her sexual relationship with her spouse, and her mikvah night was coming up, and she wanted to know, like, it's been a long time, since we had sex on the night. What do you think we should do? And I was like, well, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm like, what do you want? Like, she was even surprised by that question because she never asked herself that. Her husband didn't necessarily either ask her that. So her being able to pause and think, like, what do I want? Do I want to have sex? Do I want to just cuddle? Do I want to make out and go to sleep and have intercourse tomorrow or something else? Is so powerful. Like Elisheva said, it's so much more desirable, and the libido will slowly climb back up if you're having positive experience on top of positive experience. The experience is negative, and then it's negative. The brain and body remembers that, and it's like, well, I don't want to do that. That wasn't really fun. That wasn't enjoyable for me. That wasn't so satisfying or pleasurable. And that basically continues this like chain reaction of a disinterest. So I think, again, that it's just so beautiful that there are so many sources that complement a woman's pleasure, consent, having a beautiful relationship, that it should be loving and safe and enjoyable for both partners. And, I just think that that's amazing.
So a question that just came up in the chat, and I want to come back to the discussion that we're having, which is what is considered successful consummation? So certainly that's a sheer unto itself of what qualifies for all these things. But in general, to get rid of the Isser Yichud, so that a husband and wife can live together after marriage, we normally say really a very little amount of intimacy is enough to qualify, like a little bit of penetration. So at least an attempt for sex. There may be some poskim who would be more lenient, even if that's not done in an emergency case, but I'm saying at least an attempt, for some sort of penetration, even a very, very small amount, as the Gemara does discuss, Hachnasat HaThara, just the tip going in, does qualify as an act of sex. In terms of dam basulim, breaking the hymen, so that is also debated, but most poskim really do say full penetration, the entire aver, the entire penis of the man entering into the woman qualifies for dam basulim unless she bleeds before that. So if there's less of that penetration, but when he pulls out there is blood, that is assuming dam basulim, or if there's full penetration, even with no blood, that's when we assume dam basulim. So that's when we would assume the husband and wife then have to separate. So there's a large difference between those two. And therefore one can, attempt to have that Bia Rishona so many times. Sometimes you have students that tell me, or women that call me, it could take weeks sometimes to get from that first stage of slight penetration to full penetration. And during that time, it is possible that there wouldn't qualify if she doesn't bleed for dam basulim, and they would not have to separate before that time. So very often people come with this assumption of it's a one and done. We have sex one time, and therefore we want to hold hands for longer. We want to be together for longer. So we don't even want to try. And what they don't realize is your first attempt is just your first of a lot of attempts, especially if they're educated correctly, that he does not have to push himself in, but he can go slow and he needs to check in to see how she's doing. And if it is painful, he can pull out. And that ends up sometimes being a great thing, because then they get to snuggle and they get to, keep trying and have, a great experience. I wanted to ask Elishava and Bracha about the following question that sometimes women are asked me, and I think I saw a hint to it in the chat as well. What if your husband says, oh, I'm going to have an issue of hashchatat zera, right? I'm going to have an ejaculation, and therefore we need to have sex right now. That is an isser for him for sure. So the question is, since he needs to ejaculate inside the woman's body, what is the answer to a husband who's pressuring his wife based on claiming that this is a problem for him? What would be your answers to that question?
So I actually have an article titled "My Husband's Zera Levatala Will Be My Fault." So if you want to hear my whole rant, you can go look on elishavelis.com/blog. But the long and short of it is, and I apologize in advance if this sounds a little crass, but I think that it's important to say this. It's not for a wife to be her husband's sexual toilet. And it really, it's whatever a husband was doing from the age of puberty until he got married to manage the excruciatingly difficult urge to ejaculate extravaginally. That's what I think he would need to do if she has a legitimate reason why she's not going to be available to him sexually. Now, again, that doesn't mean that she should torture her husband and on the regular have a PG-13 makeout session and then say okay, but we're not having sex, right? That we don't want to be doing that on purpose, because that's just cruel. But at the same time, sometimes they might start making out and it feels good, and then they might stop, and she might be like, I just can't tonight. And I mean, again, Nechama, you can correct me if this is a wrong interpretation of the halacha, but it's against halacha to have sex with a wife who doesn't want to be having sex. It's against halacha to ejaculate extravaginally. So if you're going to have to choose which isser, if really he's in a position where he can't hold back anymore, again, I've never been a man, I don't know what that feels like. I empathize, sympathize at least. But if you're going to have to choose which isser, I would say choose the one that doesn't traumatize the person that you love, because Hashem will. I can't speak for God, but I would imagine that God would forgive that piece faster, and it will save a lot of aggravation rather than forcing or pressuring your wife.
So let me insert in that normally the solution for something like that would be, so again, first they can stop doing what they're doing, and it's very possible therefore that he won't ejaculate. But the other solution to do would be to enter, if she doesn't mind, slightly inside of her, barely, not, but just to kind of ejaculate in the direction of her vaginal area, which would remove the isser from him and certainly not force her. And I know for sure, especially on wedding night, people get very guilty. Oh my gosh, we didn't mean it. We didn't realize, we didn't know what we were doing. There's when it's within the realm of sexuality and intimacy between husband and wife, that's not really what this isser is about. This isser is about a man doing something separately on his own outside of the intimate life of being with his wife on purpose. And therefore, this would be something that he wouldn't control, because if he could control, then he should. But if he couldn't control, and again, if can be directed in terms of somewhat into the vaginal area, that would be something that would solve this problem.
Yeah, sorry. That's an important heter. We always try to get that, use that heter where it's available. I thought we were talking about where she's not open to sexual activity for either psychological or medical reasons altogether, which sometimes even I call it like ad velo ad bichlal, like a partial penetration or just like a tip penetration that it's when that's a possibility, that'd be great. But yeah, I think the Zeller Vatella issue is a very serious concern. I don't mean to make light of it as an isser, but I just think, when you're sort of pitting it against like the marital health piece, it just has to be handled with, a lot of sensitivity.
100%. And also men can control, they've been controlling it since puberty. So you have to, hopefully, Bracha, what do you want to say?
I would also say, like, let's be realistic. Sometimes they have not been or can't. And I would say in a situation with my clients where if we know that it's a prolonged thing, right? Let's say someone is trying to recover from sexual trauma or trying to redefine the way they relate to each other sexually, in that she doesn't just say yes when she really means to say no. Then under those circumstances, I recommend that the husband speak to their diet and like talk to your rabbi, speak to a rav who is competent, who could give you those heterim and allowances. So the man doesn't feel guilty, because then he's also now developing a sexual frustration and like, you made me sin. It's just not healthy, which obviously she didn't, right? But it's not healthy for the marriage dynamic if he's feeling like, well, I keep getting teased sexually, but I have no outlet and you don't get it. I really can't just, ejaculate outside of your body. So I think that's under those circumstances, like, talk to a rabbi who is experienced and competent in this topic.
Right. I think we are being told that we're going to be kicked off in a few minutes. So I think to close, we should all just give probably the most important point that we really would like to say. And for myself, in teaching this halacha for so long, and not normally in a very public fashion like this, normally in a closed room behind doors or with my students, I think the most important piece here is communication, is the fact that men need to communicate, women need to communicate, and there has to be an ability to speak about this. In a relationship, you speak about everything, but people sometimes don't speak about their sexual activity and their life, their sex life. And that is something that's really important. And you need to communicate what you enjoy and what you don't enjoy, because what you enjoy, he may not, and what he enjoys, you may not. So he just thinks that you enjoy what he enjoys and you think the other way, and therefore both of you can be not enjoying yourself and not really getting the pleasure that you're supposed to get, because you just didn't tell the other person what it is that you want, if you don't want, and what you want them to do more of. Communication is really, really the key, because most of the time, especially when talking about consent between husband and wife, I really would like to believe it's not because the husband wants to hurt his wife. It really is because he doesn't know, or vice versa. Again, the spouse doesn't realize that they're imposing on their spouse something that they don't want. And therefore, we need to find our voice, and we need to realize that halacha gives, especially to the women, gives us a voice to be able to say, yes, it might be Friday night. It might be Friday night that is mikvah night. It doesn't matter. I get to say if this is something that I want or I don't want. And it's on the other spouse to kind of say, well, if this is something I want, how am I going to make it so this is something that you want? How am I going to put in the effort to make this something that is special for both of us? I think that would be my message. Elisheva?
Thank you. That was so eloquent. I guess the only thing that I would, well, there's so much to add, but the one thing that I would add to that is, besides for the communication, which is so vital, is the empathy, because some of the examples that keep coming up, even just over the course of tonight's talk, are when they're not on the same page, right? When, let's say, she's having, physical or psychological distress and he wants sex, or he's feeling sexually frustrated because she's not able to, be available sexually in the way he wants to. I think it can make all the difference in the world. And I see this as a clinician, the couples who will come in with this problem, but they've like got each other's backs, and they're like, she's just like, yeah, I feel so bad for him. I love him and I want to be there for him and I want this to work. We just have to figure out this problem. Or where he'll say to her, he'll say about her or to her, like, and I feel terrible. Like, I don't want to be hurting her. I don't want to be stressing her out. Like, I don't want this to be something that's scary for her. How can we fix this? And I'll always really admire and give couples the feedback when it's like, she's not looking at him as like, you're the problem. He's not looking at her as you're the problem. You're not the problem. You're not the problem. The problem is the problem. And we're on the same team. And very often all these issues, you know, the erotophobia, genophobia, the dyspareunia, the vaginismus, all this others, the zera concerns, all of that become much smaller and more manageable and contextualized when there's that empathy and that connection and that sense of like, we're in this together, we're going to figure it out. There's a solution. We'll talk to clinicians, we'll talk to a PT, a sex therapist, a rabbi, a yoetza, you know, we'll have a team and we'll figure it out. That makes all the difference in terms of managing and localizing this issue to the bedroom so that it doesn't have to erode the relationship and make things worse and traumatic.
Totally. Well, communication and empathy, I would say that is the top two. But if I had to, I would say that knowledge is power, right? At the end of the day, you need that communication, and that empathy is vital for the emotional safety. But the more knowledge that you have, that is how you could use that for your communication and empathy, and be able to be together in a way that is happy and satisfying and joyful and pleasurable and consensual, because that was the discussion, right? Couples go into marriage today thinking that I have to have sex on mikveh night. We need to have sex on, you know, the wedding night, or you owe me sex, and all of those negative narratives that are not in line with halacha. That could be very damaging. And the more time that goes by in a marriage, the more negatively it can impact them. So I would say learn, follow more classes like this, talk to clinicians like Elisheva said, contact your local yoetza, speak to a rabbi who is experienced, who actually promotes positive sexuality. And I think that that will ensure couples the healthiest, safest type of relationships.
You know, communication, empathy, and education. That's like the trifecta, right?
Very good. We didn't plan that.
Yeah, no, that was totally, you put us on the spot, Nechama, but I think it worked. I'm so happy that Bracha brought up education, because before we went to prepare, somebody said like, oh, what are you going to offer in terms of resources? And I know I mentioned this before, but I really have a tremendous amount of free content material on my blog. So on my website, so if you go on elishevelis.com, there is a resources section that has a lot of books, because a lot of people don't have the right education to understand their sexual needs and their spouse's sexual needs, and education can make all the difference. And in terms of educating the next generation, I have a course called Sacred Not Secret. If you go, it's linked there on my website, elishevelis.com/sacred not secret. If you were in the health and halacha, like if you heard it here, you can use code HANDH to save, I think it's $25 off. And if you put in that code, you can save on the that's not free. The course is not free, but the blogs are free and the resource list is free. And so, you know, education is such a great springboard, because then you can have these conversations, you can communicate, and then once you have the communication, you understand where the other person's at, you can build the empathy. So so please, you know, please avail yourself of all these resources. And Nechama, thank you so much for hosting us.
And I just wanted to say that I think 100% when a kala is being educated in terms of all these halachot, all parents out there, make sure that they choose smartly. You know, it's not about who's the cheapest class. It's who's going to educate your daughter and, you know, your future daughter-in-law or your granddaughter, whatever it is, to have a healthy sex life for her, which is going to be so important to her for her entire life. And it is really important to allow, you know, I think sometimes parents, we have to encourage our children to reach out to sources like Elisheva and Bracha, who are amazing and help so many people in this area, and to have the right kala teacher, and to make sure that they are fully educated so that their experiences, and especially that wedding night experience, they have an amazing one, you know. And especially if those of you listening who say, that wasn't my experience, well, we want better for the next generation. And thank God, you know, we have people who are really here to help and support the yoetzot 100%, but also, you know, these incredible women who are out there to help, you know, help everybody in this area. So I want to thank Elisheva and Bracha so much. It was such a pleasure to work with you tonight. I want to thank Nishmat for hosting this incredible, you know, conference with all these speeches, and for giving us the platform to talk about things that are so incredibly important. I am so privileged to be a yoetza halacha, and I think that Nishmat is doing amazing things, educating in all these areas, especially in this area, which is normally taboo, something that people don't talk about very often. So again, thank you, Elisheva and Bracha, and everybody who's been on. Thank you so much for staying, and have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Good night.